Hi, good morning. I'm John Lentz. I'm City and State's Albany Bureau Chief. And we have a terrific panel here this morning, and we have a lot to cover. So I want to jump right in. But first of all, I want to recognize Councilman Donovan Richards, who's here in the audience. And brief intros. Next to me is Commissioner Joan McDonald with the State Department of Transportation. Next to her is Hugh O'Neill, the president of the consulting firm Appleseed and a former assistant executive director at the Port Authority. Next to him is Tom Prendergast, chairman and CEO at the MTA. Next to him is Lori Ardito, first deputy commissioner for the New York City Department of Transportation. And at the far end is my co-moderator, Jonathan Bowles, executive director of the Center for an Urban Future, which recently put out a report, Caution Ahead. He'll give you a few brief points on that and start it off with the first question.
All right, thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. As John said, I run the Center for an Urban Future, and we put out a report called Caution Ahead. I think that while that didn't just focus on transportation infrastructure, this was obviously a big part of the report. And we all know that transportation infrastructure in New York City has come such a long way in the last 25 or 30 years. We're no longer have the track fires that was so common. We haven't been shutting down bridges like we were in the 1980s. Yet the system is still old, and in many cases we're seeing a lot of malfunctions. Obviously, there are things that need to be taken care of. Just a few quick bullet points that we kind of talked about in the report. 11% of bridges in 2012 were structurally deficient in New York City. 37% of the mainline subway signals exceeded their useful 50-year life. The number of city streets and highways that were in poor or fair condition were on the increase over the last 5 to 10 years. So that just kind of is a kind of setting the stage for some of the issues I think we're going to talk about today. And Tom, I wanted to start with you. I think of all agencies, clearly MTA has really also come a long way. The system is in so much better shape than it was. I think when we reached out to people, experts about the state of the MTA's infrastructure, one thing we heard that still has work to do is on the modernization of the system. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that, but also in particular, you know, we noted in the report that even by the end of 2034, we're told that approximately half of the system will still use outdated fixed block signals. So what could be done? What is the MTA doing to expedite this?
One of the problems we have is we have a very old system. It was first constructed at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. As we try to bring new technology into the system, it's far harder to do as a retrofit than it is to do with a greenfield, the building of a new system. And we operate 24/7, so that makes it even more difficult. The need to go to upgraded signal systems for not only improved safety and reliability, but improved capacity is a challenge that we have. And we've got one line already done, that's the Canarsie line. We're doing another line, number 7 line. And the next line will be the Queens Boulevard line, which is the second most heavily traveled line in the country. And we're going to continue that effort. But one thing that we have to deal with, it's the constant challenge, is how do you integrate new technology in an aging system 24/7? And it's something that we will just keep working on and try to accelerate. Money is not the sole contributor in terms of limiting it. It's this issue of 24/7 and not shutting the system down. We've seen a tremendous increase in ridership. When I left as head of subways in 1994, we carried 3.5 million people a day. We now carry 5.4 million people a day, with no major increase in capacity. So that's people riding on weekends and on nights, which is when we would traditionally like to do this, take lines out of service and do work. So that's one of the challenges we have.
Just a quick follow-up. I know that the governor has announced this Transportation Reinvention Commission. Does that play into this at all?
Absolutely. I mean, our first capital program, Dick Ravitch got us $8 billion, 82 to 86. $8 billion then was a lot of money. It's a lot of money now, but that really translates more like into the high 20s. We spent some $90 billion. And the first 4 programs was nothing but state of good repair, safety and reliability. Then we went back to expansion, 2nd Avenue Subway, East Side Access, number 7 extension. But now we're being told by people, and rightfully so, there's 2 challenges that we must face. One is climate change. I mean, in the current capital program, we never knew Sandy was going to hit us in the middle of the capital program. And yet we're seeing the most extensive amount of rebuild due to damage done to the system on top of our capital program. The other is our 20-year needs assessment. We look into the future. We always look into state of good repair, and we know how we have to do that to replace aging assets. But our customers today, the millennials, you talk to them about the problems of 82 and track fires and derailments and graffiti. And it's like my parents talking to me about the Great Depression and the Great War. And it's like I listened to those stories 1 or 2 times, but it didn't mean anything to me because I didn't experience them. The millennials' expectations are really things that we thought were luxuries when we first rode the system, but they think are entitlements. And they're our customers. They're a growing customer base. So countdown clocks in stations, more timely information, improved technology is not it's a want, it's a need. And the Reinvention Commission, what the governor's asked us to do is make sure we go beyond state of good repair, deal with climate change, deal with those new needs.
Thank you. Lori, our Caution Ahead report pointed out that over 30% of the city's roads were only in poor or fair condition recently, up from about 15.7% in 2000. And that was before this year's really tough winter. How is the administration addressing this?
Actually, in this last budget round, the mayor did give us extra capital funds to deal with, and we will be doing additional lane miles. But as I was just talking to a former DOT commissioner out here, we all know that this additional money is going to just keep us at more of a status quo. But certainly, we're going to be continuing to look for additional funds to do more resurfacing. Right now, we're budgeted to do 1,000 lane miles a year. We've already been able to accomplish 175 lane miles to date, which is due to some of our improved technology. We have asphalt that we can provide and put down on the roadways in colder weather. So that does help, and it also is hopefully helping in terms of the pothole scenario that we have out there. And up to date, from January, we filled 340,000 potholes to date.
And you just announced a new asphalt plant. Is that going to help with this, or?
Absolutely. Actually, yesterday we were out with the mayor, announced the rebuild of the asphalt plant, Hamilton Avenue asphalt plant, which supplies over 50% of our asphalt, supplied to the city, and it's going to improve for many reasons. We have the technology is improved, and so that'll help us produce more tons per year.
Now, one point that Jonathan's report touches on is funding, how to address some of these problems. One question always is federal funding. And just this week, President Obama was in the state to talk about the Tappan Zee Bridge, about other funding. And Commissioner McDonald, if you could talk about what that sends to you, what message that means for federal dollars for New York.
Sure. For those of you who can't see, my face is quite sunburned because I was at the Tappan Zee Bridge yesterday. And it was really a landmark day for the state of New York, for the city of New York, and for the region. The governor and the president have made a priority infrastructure investment. And the Tappan Zee Bridge is a perfect example of how, when we set our minds to it, we can get things done. I think, as many of you in this room know, that the planning and the design for the Tappan Zee Bridge had languished for approximately 10 years. When the governor came in, he told us to get our act together and get going and replace the bridge. And the timing was such that in 2011, when the president announced his expedited planning and permitting process, the project was teed up to do that. And that's one of the areas that the president focused on yesterday, is really making sure that the planning and project delivery process are expedited so that as he fights and works with the Congress to get more additional funding, that projects are ready to go. And I think that that is a very, very strong message. And I think one of his other points was his favorite presidents were, when it comes to infrastructure, were all Republicans. He mentioned Abraham Lincoln and the railroad, the Intercontinental Railroad, the start of that. He mentioned Dwight Eisenhower and the interstate highway system. And he mentioned Ronald Reagan and his investments in infrastructure. And the point was that it is a bipartisan, apolitical issue, or it should be. And it's not today. But I think we are seeing some very positive movement. The Senate has put its bill out. The President has put his reauthorization bill out, which is very exciting. It is really focusing on both highways and bridges and transit in a way that it's never been done before. It's got a very strong focus on freight. I think one of the things that has evolved since the original ICE-T of 1991, where we kind of started the process of looking at transportation holistically, is we're really doing it today. And I think in a way never before, I'm picking up on one of Tom's points with Superstorm Sandy, resiliency efforts are big, and there's an incentive for MPOs to come together in the President's reauthorization, and resiliency is a factor moving forward.
And another big component of the downstate transportation system is the Port Authority. It's been in the news for political issues lately. And Hugh, you put out a report of your own recently, I think in March, entitled A Port Authority That Works. Apart from these political issues, what should be done at the Port Authority to make it more efficient to perhaps increase investment in needed transportation upgrades?
The point of the report, which I wrote with Mitchell Moss at the Rudin Center here at NYU, is basically that you can fix the political problems at the Port Authority and heal the split between the two states, and you'll still have a long-term problem unless you address some serious flaws in the business model under which the Port Authority operates. What we've seen in the last couple of decades is, in effect, a narrowing of the revenue base of the Port Authority, where more and more of the Port Authority's facilities are not covering their operating costs or are not producing enough net revenue to cover their debt service. So you become more and more reliant on just a few facilities. So it's the bridges and tunnels, primarily the George Washington Bridge, and the airports that are in effect now supporting virtually everything else that the Port Authority does. That problem has been compounded by the fact that, again, over the last couple of decades, a larger and larger share of the Port Authority's capital resources have gotten diverted into sort of zero return capital projects that have very little to do, in some cases nothing to do with the Port Authority's mission, but are just projects that the two governors want done and that the Port Authority agrees to do. Probably the most egregious example of that in the last few years is the package of bridge and highway projects that the Port Authority is funding for New Jersey at a cost of $1.8 billion. So the point of our report is that the Port Authority has to get a lot more disciplined about how it invests its money, be more selective, especially at a time when its infrastructure is aging and it has some really major redevelopment needs, particularly at the airports, that it can't afford to be kind of an ATM machine for politically popular but, in a sense, non-productive or less productive investments.
Sure, and I want to follow up with that, with a question to the panel as a whole. In terms of political will, I mean, sometimes the money's there, but you have to have elected officials willing to put their popularity on the line, to put more money towards these things. At each level that you represent, where are we at in terms of political support in the state legislature, in the city council, in the de Blasio administration?
One of the reasons I came back to New York is that there's a political will to fund that which is needed. Is it on now? One of the reasons I came back to New York, because most of my career has been here, but I've gone away and I've come back, is the fact that there is the political will to find the need for the money. From the first capital program in 1982, we had $8 billion, to the current capital program, which is some $24 billion, there is an established need and there is a political will to get that money across federal, state, and local sources. And we see that continuing. I think we're in an interesting point, though, because we need to morph to new ways of being able to generate revenue and new ways of being able to identify acceptable and sustainable revenue sources. And we also need to move into the direction of true whole life asset management. And the first days of the capital program was real simple to say you put money in cars and track because that's how bad the system was. and you defer some of the other investments because they were able to get you along. We now need to get to the point where, after finding these funding and revenue sources, we're appropriately squeezing all the useful life out of those assets. We never want to cross the line into safety and reliability, but it's very important that we're getting as much useful life out of every asset, because the MTA asset is $967 billion. That's almost $1 trillion. And I remind other engineers I work with, $1 billion is 1,000 million, $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. It's a lot of money. And we don't have the luxury of wasting $1 million here, $1 million there. I was born and raised in a state where Edward Everett Dirksen was the senator. You remember his famous quote? $1 billion here, $1 billion there, sooner or later we're talking real money. We've got to get to that issue.
Again, on the city level, I have to agree with Tom. City, state, and federal level, you know, the de Blasio administration has a great working relationship, and we continue to go to our elected officials and continue to ask them to help us with legislation and with funding. And you know, we at City DOT we're really successful. We've been really successful at going after grants. And we will continue to do that to see if we can get more funding for a lot of our to make our streets safer in New York City. So yeah, we have a great relationship, and we will continue to work with both the federal, state, and local elected officials.
A couple of points. First of all, Governor Cuomo, like many governors across the country, have stepped up to the plate in the last several years when the federal government did not. In 2012, on the heels of the passage of the design build legislation, he advocated for and got in the state budget his New York Works program, which allowed New York State DOT to accelerate $1.2 billion worth of projects in 2012, 13, and 14 that we weren't going to do until 15, 16, and 17. And the reason he did that was he saw, A, we needed to make the investment in infrastructure, and B, it was a good thing to do from the economy from two perspectives. Number one, it put people to work right away, but number two, it sends a message to the businesses in the state of New York that the government is serious about making investments in infrastructure. So that is a very positive sign. You know, the MTA 5-year capital plan is in the development process. New York State DOT is updating its 5-year capital plan process, which includes not only state roads and bridges, but also local roads and bridges and the canal bridges across the state. So that has to be the starting point for the discussion about what the needs are. And I think one of the things that is changing when we talk about the dialogue on all levels of government is that it's not just a transportation issue, it's not just an economic development issue. Whether you believe in climate change or not, the weather is impacting how we have to make investments. We just went through, as did the MTA, a process of submitting an application to FEMA, where we put in our first round, $287 million, 51 bridges, for bridges that were affected, highly affected by scour and water. And the process that FEMA uses to determine whether the investment is a good one is different from what Federal Highway looks at. They do a benefit cost analysis to see if you are an evacuation route, are you on a route to a hospital, so I think the dialogue about transportation is not just about transportation, and I think that's a very, very positive thing for the state, the city, and the country as a whole.
I wanted to follow up on this because I hear you on political will. At the same time, you know, our Caution Ahead report, just looking at state of good repair needs for New York City across all sorts of agencies, and that's not just transportation infrastructure, but we identified $47 billion in needs over the next 5 years, and only a fraction of that has been funded thus far. So I want to kind of ask about that, but also clearly there's less money and less will coming from Washington. And so, how are we going to get around that? A couple of you have mentioned new ways of dedicated revenue streams. You know, we've heard about some of the ideas of tolling on the East River bridges, which seems like it's got some promise. But what can we do? What are specific ideas that you all have for new revenue streams that are dedicated for transportation infrastructure projects in this region? No ideas?
This is not one where people will necessarily rush to the microphone. When I went to Vancouver and we were faced with some of the same challenges, I started a process by going to all the urban areas, first in North America and then looking to Europe. But there's problems when you look to Europe and Asia because some of the financial and political models are different. When you looked at different funding sources, what we did is try to look to see what everybody's doing to try to change with this. There has to be a paradigm shift in terms of where you're going to get your revenues from. So you go to any city, San Francisco, LA. First of all, there's more of a recognition that you can spend time going to Washington, but you'll come back with less money even though you spend more money on trips. And that's just the nature of the beast. So you keep fighting that. But you try to generate as much of the revenue as you can. So you have things like congestion toll pricing. You toll bridges. You toll facilities. You do any one of a number of things. And you take a look at what those cities do and how they have that dialogue. And if you talk to people that have gone down that path, they will tell you a couple things. Do an exhaustive look at what the different revenue sources are. Make sure you fully communicate to people what the impact to them will be in terms of going into their pocket, but what promises you're going to make in terms of what the outputs they're going to see. Because people don't mind taking money as long as they see a return on the investment. And the other thing they say is be resilient in your charge. You will most likely not get the dialogue right the first time. You will not vote up what you want to have done the first time. So you have to be persistent and you have to be exhaustive. And that's a process you talk to anybody that's gone through, I think we're going to have to go through.
Any other ideas? And also, what do you all think about the Sam Schwartz plan, the Move New York plan for the tolling?
Thanks, Tom. Well, that's okay. Well, obviously, you know, the mayor is taking a hard look at it, and you know, we're certainly open. We've certainly looked at it, and we're going to continue to talk about it and continue moving forward.
What do you think, Hugh?
I'm probably a minority voice on this, but I have significant problems with the Sam Schwartz plan. I think that the way the restructuring that it proposes to me appears to be more politically driven than economically driven. Longer term.
Politically, in that it's trying to get support.
Yeah. Trying to fix the political problems of the original congestion pricing plan rather than really kind of starting fresh. In the long run, I think congestion pricing is a good idea, but one of the problems I have with Sam's plan is that it's investing a lot of money in the implementation of a technology that I think is about to become obsolete, and that in terms of really generating substantial amounts of money on a more consistent basis, and I think a more equitable basis, we should be looking at what we could possibly do, say, over the next decade, and this will really require action at the federal level, I think, to put in place a system of universal road pricing. I don't have any problem with the idea that people drivers should perhaps be paying more money to drive into Manhattan, but driving into Manhattan is not the only, and I would argue probably not even the worst congestion problem in the region. You know, why shouldn't people have to pay a little bit extra to drive on the Van Wyck to get to Kennedy Airport? Now, I would argue that you don't want to necessarily be putting toll booths all over the place, but I think that technology is available that would allow us to, in effect, have everybody pay everywhere they drive, and how much that might be would vary a lot from one highway in one part of the region to another. But I think that would make a lot more sense than just saying, okay, we're going to put a cordon around Manhattan, and if you drive across 60th Street, you have to pay, $7.50 or whatever to cross that line.
Can I follow up with one more thing? And Joan, let me start with you, but this is really open to everybody. Obviously, we talked about raising revenues and the need for that, but also when there's such limited funds, we want to make sure that the money we do have goes far, and a lot of people question whether that's really the case today. The cost of building infrastructure is obviously high in New York. Why is that? And I'm particularly curious, what do you think about the future of design build? Is that important, and is it going to get renewed this year?
The future of design build for the state of New York. Okay, now, can you hear me now? Okay. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, in late 2011, the state adopted design build legislation for the Thruway Authority, DOT, parks, and DEC. And we have used it significantly. And if we didn't have that, the New York Works program that I mentioned earlier, we would not have been able to advance most of those projects. It is one of the key tools in the toolbox, and I think it saves money, but it is changing the dialogue with the design and construction industry, because you make a decision on who you're going to select based on the best value. And the best value factors are cost, but they're also schedule. But equally important, and sometimes more important, are the innovative approaches that contractors and consulting engineers bring to the table. They may have done a project using innovative techniques in another part of the world that they bring to the state of New York. And I always like to highlight one great example. The Hutchinson River Parkway, right on the Bronx-Westchester border, was one of 13 bridges in a Lower Hudson Valley design build package. So the contracting and design team had the package of 13 bridges, and for that particular deck, which carries 80,000 vehicles a day, they came up with a plan where they closed that small section of the Hutch, rerouted traffic for 5 days. Precast, the decks were in place. We did a lot of public outreach. We coordinated with New York City DOT for signal timing, for traffic enforcement. We did a lot of outreach to the businesses and the communities. And then when we sent out the press release that it was all done, not a peep, which in my world means we did a good job because nobody complained. But the ability to get that done in 5 days is something that we need to continue to have, and to encourage the community at large, contractors, design engineers, architects, to continue to be creative, use new materials. That's the way of the future.
Sure, and I wanted to follow up on that with another question about how we best spend our limited funding. One thing that struck me in this Caution Ahead report is that Mayor Bloomberg actually increased capital spending, but focused more on new projects to some degree at the expense of maintenance, of repaving roads. And there's similar questions at the MTA. Is it a Band-Aid approach with some of these things they're fixing up in stations? And with investment in signals, is that something, if it's going to take decades, will it be obsolete by the time it's done? So broadly, are we wisely spending our money? Are we doing the best we can with the limited funds that we have?
Well, it's easy for me to say we are, but we need to have the dialogue because other people need to question it. And if they question it, we need to be able to come up with effective answers. There's a number of areas I think we can do a better job. There's other areas we're limited in. There is no system in the world that has 468 stations. Yet New York City Transit has 468 stations. So you can start something, you can load it with a lot of resources in terms of money and contractors and designers, but by the time you get it done, it's into the next century. So we've actually taken a decision to, instead of doing a whole-scale replacement of stations, to try to refine them. Certainly I'd like a greenfield, be able to design a station from scratch that would look more like a metro system or the LA metro system, but we don't really have that luxury. In terms of signals, we have to do it less for safety and reliability, because it's a very safe system. We move 8,000 trains a day, 5.4 million people. But in terms of capacity, because you can't lengthen trains, you can't lengthen platforms, we've got to go to communication-based train control. It was very frustrating for me. I was the chief electrical officer when we made the decision, policy-wise, to go from wayside block to communication-based train control. And that was done in 1990. And yet the first line that was done, the Congestion line, took 12 years to do. We need to pick up that pace. Otherwise, we'll be 300 years before we change the system. And like I said, not for safety and reliability, for throughput and capacity.
Just a quick follow-up then. In terms of safety, is New York City's transportation infrastructure in such poor shape in any case that there is, problems in terms of safety? I think the report talks about bridges in the city being at a very low level in terms of their quality, their reliability. You've seen some high-profile safety issues at the MTA with the Metro North train, with a recent subway derailment. Is safety an issue here?
Well, certainly in Metro North's case, I'd be lying if I didn't tell you we weren't concerned. For what was the #1 system in the Western Hemisphere, it's had a fall from grace. And I can tell you the fall from grace didn't happen in 14 or 18 months. It happened over a period of time. There was a breakdown inside the organization in terms of culture. There was probably over-focus on on-time performance. And while on-time performance is important, people have a right to expect to be safe and get to where they wanted to get to, the same condition they were in when they got on the train. So that's something we need to go back and fix, and that's a cultural issue. That's a cultural issue that management is accountable for, no one else. It wasn't due to lack of funding. But we are going to put in a positive train control system, because we've come to a day where we cannot rely solely on a single human being to be able to assure safety. And I do not say that in a negative way toward human beings. But all of our time schedules are stretched beyond that which is acceptable. You've got more things to do at work. You've got more things to do for your children. You've got more things to do for the communities you serve in. And where do you make that sacrifice? And how much you rest and how much you sleep. And yet we're still relying on people to run these complicated systems because that's the way they were first designed. So we need to accelerate in the implementation of a positive train control system for the 2 commuter railroads, and we will do that, and we'll have it in place. But those are the types of issues we need to deal with, and need to deal with them on a priority basis.
In terms of the city bridge infrastructure, it's actually the best. It's in the best condition it's been in generations. But obviously, if we continue at the same funding levels that we're at right now, over the course of the next 10 to 20 years, they will start falling into poorer condition. But again, we're going to continue to look for that additional funding. And one of the points that Joan made earlier about design build. We've seen some success here in the city with design build. We just actually did the Hamilton Avenue plant and saved $5 million. We have the St. George ferry terminal ramps that we recently completed, also on design build, and they came in on time and under budget. So the city is definitely looking to do more design build, and we're looking for legislation to get passed so that we can continue it down here. So that's one of our big pushes this year.
My last question is why do we, and not just the MTA, but all of our transportation agencies have such a hard time projecting costs and then sticking and kind of keeping those costs down? And just a couple examples, obviously East Side Access, it's about 7 years behind schedule and I think $4 billion over budget. The Downtown Path train station is $2 billion over budget and 6 years behind schedule. The Fulton Street Transit Center is 5 years behind schedule. What do we need to be doing differently?
Since 2 of those 3 examples relate to me, I guess I've got to pick up the microphone. Both Fulton Street and East Side Access are projects that are over $1 billion. That is not a core competency of the MTA in its past history. It's gotten better at it. East Side Access, I was president of Long Island Railroad when that project first got initiated, and there were some guesses that it would be in the order of $2 to $3 billion. But the first number that got pegged was $4.3 billion. It's now $10 billion. It is a very, very complicated project. I think we underestimated the amount of tunneling and mining that was done. If you actually go down to the caverns and see how much earth has been moved, we totally underestimated that in terms of its cost. And yet we have to finish that project. And it's frustrating for me because I've never been associated, put the project aside in terms of the problems with it. But generally when you work in an organization, you're dealing with a staff sitting at a table, and a project from the time it's an inception thought in somebody's mind to it's completed is maybe 5 to 7 years, not 15 to 20. And so, you know what the definition of stress is when you can't put your, hands around somebody's neck and squeeze. But, you know, you sit at a table and you're talking about a project that has got another 7 to 8 years to go, and it's likely some of the people sitting at the table that are responsible for it aren't there. Now, I'm not saying that they're mindless to it, but that's a challenge. But we can't waste precious dollars. It's a very important project. It'll be transformational. There'll be 2 terminals in Manhattan, open up when it's completed. When it's completed, access for Metro North into the west side, so that'll be very important. Fulton Street's Transit Center, I think in some ways the eyes were bigger than the stomach could handle. So, but we need to manage those projects carefully because we can't afford to waste billions of dollars like I talked about before.
I think there are 2 things that are important to note. I think historically in transportation, in the planning process, there's been a reticence, almost a fear of putting real numbers out there. Because if you put real numbers out there, the project's never going to get built. So when you start looking at an East Side Access, when we start looking at a Kosciuszko Bridge, there's an initial fear that if we put a project out that's going to cost $10 billion, that it's never going to happen. So I think that's a little bit of historically what's happened. And then I think a second component is in the industry, and it's not just in this state and in this city, but once you start a project, you don't stop it. So there's never been any real negative for cost overruns because you're going to build the project. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do think there is today, with the tight resources, much more focus on the front end of really doing your due diligence to get correct cost estimates for projects, and really having accountability. We've instituted accountability into state DOT. We have it sounds funny, but we have each of the projects has either a red light, a yellow light, or a green light, and if it's and it starts right at the beginning. If it tips 5% over budget, there has to be a correction plan to come in, and it goes from a $2 million paving project upstate to the $400 million Alexander Hamilton Bridge, which is finishing under budget and ahead of schedule.